This is a diagram here which shows you the layers of the skin, and in the foreground there's the detail and in the background there's the overview. So as with all these pictures, you've got an unlabeled image and a labeled image, and the idea is that the unlabeled image is somehow clearer in terms of your visual recall. You can sort of picture that and hopefully glean that information in the short term and the long term once you've understood the picture. So just going to go through it. In the background, the layers of the skin, well, there's the epidermis, which is extremely thin. In actual fact, the diagram doesn't really represent that, but the majority of the thickness of the skin is the dermis, which is probably about 95%. Of course, underneath that you have the fatty tissue. The epidermis is divided into the horny zone, as it's called, and the germinative zone, and these are the sort of progressively hardened skin cells which actually sort of die and shed, as it were, sort of as the cells develop. That's a very natural, normal process. Underneath the epidermis is the dermis, which is the vast majority of the thickness of the skin, and we have the papillary dermis above and the reticular dermis below. The papillary dermis more superficial, closer to the skin, and the reticular dermis deeper down. The hair follicles are represented here, and the eccrine glands. So these adnexal structures, as we call them, they exist within the skin, and you can see how the epidermis tends to track down around these structures. You see how the hair follicle has epidermis encompassing its root, if you will. So the 5 layers of the epidermis from the bottom up are the stratum basale, followed by the spinosum, followed by the granulosum, followed by the lucidum, followed by the corneum. So the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum, these are the 2 layers of the germinative layer of the epidermis, where the cells are more actively growing and developing as they move upwards. So the stratum basale, or the basal layer as it's sometimes known, this is the actively proliferating layer of the skin, and it contains in particular melanocytes and Merkel cells. Melanocytes, these are the cells which produce the pigment which is then redistributed to the skin cells. And actually it's an incredibly beautiful system where the pigment is distributed to the cells through projections from the melanocytes themselves, and this pigment, this melanin, actually distributes over the nucleus of the keratinocytes, and like an umbrella, if you will, it protects them from the harmful effects of the sun. So it's kind of incredible, really, if you think about it. So the next layer up in the germinative zone of the epidermis is the spinosum, sometimes called the Prickle cell layer. This contains large keratinocytes, and this is where the keratin starts to be produced. So-called prickle cells because the cells are kind of connected by what are called tonofibrils, and so that's how that works here. Just notice that there's these Langerhans cells present in this layer. These Langerhans cells form an important part of the immune system. As again, you can see these projections between the cells, which sort of elegantly serve to assess and detect what's going on in the environment of the cell. And then we've got the stratum granulosum, the granular layer, where there are granules of keratin present. And this is the predominant site of protein synthesis. The stratum lucidum, so-called the clear layer, it's actually present predominantly in the thick skin of the palms and of the soles on the hands and the feet. And then finally at the top, this non-viable, hard, keratinizing, protective stratum corneum, which sort of is one of those key anatomical components of the human body, sort of that external protective layer, insulates, protects against fluid loss. It's a barrier, and a very clever system where it sort of sheds over time. Just a bit about the large 95% of the skin, which is the dermis. We've got that papillary layer. This is the upper of the two, the more superficial, contains more cells, finer collagen fibers, and it provides the mechanical anchorage and metabolic support for the overlying epidermis. And then underneath, the reticular dermis, which is something, a system there which contains fewer cells, and it has more coarse collagen. And these two layers are separated by the vascular plexus, a system of blood vessels there. So that's an overview of how the skin exists, of what the skin is like in terms of anatomical layers. And if you just reflect now on what we've been talking about and use this unlabeled image here to sort of visualize these different layers, I've color coded them, I've made it sort of associative where possible. You can sort of picture these melanocytes in this basal layer, the Merkel cells. These little cells here, these are fibroblasts, which produce the fibrin. And I didn't talk about it, but these are the sensory organs, the Meissner's corpuscles and the Pacinian corpuscles, which give you your touch and proprioceptive sensation within the skin, the hair follicles and the structures and essentially how it all works. So that's it.